All right, thank you all for being here. Very grateful for those of you who are here at such a late hour. We're looking forward to presenting on the topic, but then also to having hopefully an open discussion on the questions pertaining to this topic. Although our panelists will be presenting, we're aiming for a little bit more of a roundtable sort of feel. So we will have presentations, we'll have discussions among the panel, but then we'd like to get your input as well. I want to thank you and my fellow panelists. I also like to thank ISI for hosting discussions like this. I can't think of a better setting or a better audience to have this kind of a conversation. My name is Michael Gonzalez. I'm an assistant professor and the senior associate director at the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership at the University of Toledo. So the Institute is the first of 5 of the new schools of civic thought and leadership in the state of Ohio. Since 2016, there's been over 13 of these state-established centers proliferating. And ours was the first in Ohio, and Ohio is proudly the owner of 5 of these centers. Let me introduce my fellow panelists. So first is Adam Thomas, who's the executive director of the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. We have Peter Koritanski, who's the director of the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at Cleveland State University, which is another of the 5 schools of civic thought and leadership in Ohio. And Professor Deborah O'Malley, my colleague, an assistant professor at the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. And then finally, also from our program at the University of Toledo, sorry, we're here.
Other side.
There you are, Jonathan Culp, the director of the Institute. So Ohio is showing pretty strongly and proudly. And Adam, who is not coming from an institution in Ohio, nevertheless comes from the state of Ohio originally. This coming from a native Texan who went out to Ohio to teach civics. To introduce this topic, I want to observe that there are these 13 established centers, or more than 13 now. They've got resources, in many cases hiring authority, curricular authority in many cases as well, and sometimes quite independent, and even state-mandated civics courses, which is quite convenient when you are a civics center, to get students into the classroom. But I think the question remains, what kind of a civic formation or serious civic education can you give in a mass democracy, in a society that's increasingly driven by mass processes and mass effects? And that's to say nothing of the question of what kind of a civic education can you give in a lecture hall of 150 plus undergraduates, which is its own sort of mass phenomenon and experience. This conference takes its name from Churchill's essay, Mass Effects in Modern Life. And so I'd like to start with just quoting a passage from that essay, which pertains to civic formation. Churchill writes, "We are witnessing a great diminution in the number of independent people who had some standing of their own, albeit a small one, and who, if they conducted their affairs with reasonable prudence, could live by no man's leave underneath the law. They may be better off as the salaried officials of great corporations, but they have lost in forethought, in initiative, in contrivance, in freedom, and in effective civic status. Mass democracy tends to level all goals and to homogenize human character. In such a regime and such a society, then is it still possible to lead students to see citizenship, say nothing of statesmanship, as a noble office? The mass technological processes we create to bring us convenience also tend to diminish human agency, as Churchill also observes in this essay, if not also diminishing human rationality itself. In a society so deeply invested in expanding, accelerating, and optimizing the administration of things, is it futile to try teaching citizens what it means to rule and be ruled in turn? And again, all of this in addition to the simply practical question of trying to achieve a noticeable effect in mass course sections and with students who often feel quite cynical, at best often quite pragmatic, are wondering how this is going to help them to get ahead economically in life. So in this situation, I think it is a real temptation for teachers to slip into despair, notwithstanding all of the resources and hiring authority and curricular authority that is unlocked. But the premise of this panel is that we should not give up the ship in a storm just because we cannot command the winds. And I'll be inviting my fellow panelists to all speak to this topic. We'll begin with Adam Thomas, who will speak on Ciceronian civic education and what we can still learn from Cicero, even in an age of mass democracy. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here. So as Michael said, my contribution here is to say something about Cicero and what he can still teach us today or inspire us today to do in terms of civic education. Cicero is one of those authors, of course, who seems to have been totally eclipsed by the mass society, mass democracy that Churchill is analyzing in the essay that is inspiring our conference. However, one could not overstate Cicero's influence in the wider Western tradition of civic education, including in the 17th and 18th centuries and during the American founding and the early American Republic. Whether it's in James Wilson's lectures on law, John Adams's defense of the United States constitutions, or in the educational institutions in the United States. His thought was particularly resonant with both the society and the politics of that time, right? When education was done in these elite institutions, preparing people for lives in the church or in the civil state, right? These public lives of responsibility. And when politics was done in a much more patrician kind of manner by men of independent means, right? Who had some kind of ideal of disinterested service to the Republic as their point of pride and such great resistance to partisan politics. All that, therefore, seems to indicate that maybe Cicero is not the kind of person we would read to sort of get some purchase on what we might do today in designing a civic education. But my kind of paper, my remarks are about trying to see what we could glean from him in thinking about these things today. And what I'm going to do is try to articulate three at least of the principles underlying Cicero's thought regarding civic education and the kind of result that he would hope to achieve, I think, through an educational system or institutions. And those three things come in the form, characteristically for Cicero, of convergences. He's a thinker who has this reputation for trying to bring harmony where other thinkers, particularly the Greeks, saw division or antinomy. And those three areas of convergence are, first, regarding the philosophic and political lives, which Plato or Socrates very famously analyzed as quite distinct and in some opposition or competition. Secondly, the quest for the best regime or best constitution and devotion to the Roman constitution. These two things go together for Cicero. And finally, devotion to some kind of standard of higher law or natural law and defense in a very conservative way of particular conventional institutions in Rome. So it seems like these three sort of series of convergences would seem to therefore structure a kind of educational program for Cicero. And let me just say a few things about how those convergences are made as a kind of opening contribution to this conversation. Regarding the political and philosophic lives, this is really a dispute, it seems like, for Cicero regarding what we are to make of Plato's great achievement. He agrees that Plato is divine, he is the philosopher, he is the greatest man, but he disputes with other philosophers of his time regarding what that means for us, right? In the beginning of his Republic, his rewriting of Plato, he attacks those who draw from Plato the counsel of retreat from politics. He wants to reverse this. And he has a reading of Plato and a sense of Plato's achievement as making possible instead a life that does justice to both our desire for honor and glory and for a kind of civic friendship and participation in that rule that makes that possible, but also theoretical perfection and contemplative perfection. That's Cicero's alternative. So in that way, he offers a kind of unique answer, and that's kind of the ideal that he, I think, is trying to achieve through his writings, is allowing us to have more confidence in putting these two things together, which Plato seems to have separated. This is possible for him because of Plato's achievement in his view, I think. He is able, through the study of Plato's works, to maintain a continual contact with philosophy in the deepest sense throughout his life, even when he is in active government in the Republic. So for him, Plato makes possible, again, this kind of double political and philosophic life. Now, how also this is possible is because for him, if you look closely enough and carefully at the Roman constitution, you see a kind of version of Plato's Republic unfolding before you, with a kind of guardian class empowered with privileges that it uses for the common good and for the pursuit of genuine excellence. So he sees in the Roman constitution a kind of version of either Plato's Republic or Book 7 of Aristotle's Politics, that the Roman senatorial aristocracy is a place where genuine excellence can be achieved, both theoretically and practically. I want to read you a quote of his that gives you a sense of how he's thinking about this. This is how he explains how it is that the Senate continues to have authority over the people, even as it gives the people more freedom and more a share in the sovereignty. He says the following: "The power and authority of the Senate nevertheless remained respected and great." This is in the maturity of the Republic. "Since the wisest and bravest men defended the city with arms and counsel, whose authority flourished the most because, while they outstripped the others by far in honor, they were their inferiors in pleasure, nor usually their superiors in wealth. Each man's virtue was more favorable as he defended the citizens individually in their private affairs by his works, counsel, and substance." So he's describing, right, an honorable class that does not outstrip the others in pleasure or even wealth most of the time. So it's a kind of living version of the kind of arrangement in the end of, say, Book 4 of Plato's Republic or in Book 7 of Aristotle's Politics is what he's seeing in Rome. The third thing, this allows him this kind of confidence that he can achieve genuine excellence both theoretically and practically by service to and defense of the Roman constitution, leads to a kind of double policy of defending Rome's conventional aristocracy, its conventional institutions, its ancient property relations, while also articulating a kind of natural law theory and seeing these two things as undergirding each other. I've done some work on Cicero's speeches on an agrarian law that was proposed during his consulship, which gives, I think, a sort of particular insight into how Cicero was thinking about these matters. This was proposed by one of Caesar's allies named Rullus, and it was meant to essentially undo Cicero's consulship at the very beginning by forcing him to oppose a popular measure. He does so successfully. He appears even before the people, which is quite rare in those days, and manages to get them to vote against an agrarian law, which was going to set up a sort of council of 10 men who could sell off public lands to veterans to make them smallholders. The way that he does this, he does two things. First, he appears before the people and makes clear to them that what this is going to do is set up a kind of personal power in the men who form the commission. In other words, it's going to devolve power away from the Senate and toward these men, these individuals who have their own private interests. It's a fairly basic argument. The other thing he does is very publicly promise at the beginning of the speech that he will not take a provincial governorship after he is done with his consular year, which was the sort of, K Street gig of the first century BC, right? So he insists he will not personally profit from his office, and that's part of the deal that allows the people to confidently follow him in denying this law. They will defend the prerogatives of the Senate if the Senate is not personally profiting from, right, their service. Quickly on the natural law point, when you look at Cicero's theory of natural law, it's not as sort of filled out as later thinkers. The big thing he comes back to over and over again is this foundation in natural sociality and in the desire for friendship that is sort of central to his natural law theory. That we by nature desire friendship, meaning the admiration of good men for our character and actions. And this seems to have been kind of the thing that, if you think it through, maybe is why he was so, to the end, in opposition to Caesarism. That in the end, the interest in politics for him was forming friendship with good men, men of substance and culture, as they deliberated together and made decisions on behalf of the whole, and won honor and friendship in doing so. So that, I think, would be the kind of ultimate ideal that he would be trying to achieve through a program of civic education, which is to make people capable of that kind of friendship, that kind of honor-seeking, able to be trained in law and the tradition of their country, right, to go to the center and conduct things and preserve them, and to harvest friendship with those in the establishment. He's quite aristocratic in that, but also to have a kind of mind that is trained such that if politics disappears, as it did for him on several occasions, there is still that other perfection to pursue, that is philosophy. So I think that would be the kind of ideal that he would say we should be pursuing today in our own way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to invite Professor Peter Koritanski, who will speak on Locke's reception of Cicero into modern civic life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Because we're talking about civic education here this afternoon, I thought I would talk about John Locke's treatise on education, his thoughts concerning education, and in particular, since we're also talking about Cicero, to draw attention to a remark that he makes about Cicero and to just raise a few what I would call philosophical puzzles that arise from that, and maybe which we can explore more fully in the Q&A. For those of you who aren't familiar with the thoughts on education, a lot of people who read Locke don't know the thoughts on education as well, so I'll just say a few things about it. It was published in 1693, and it was written concurrently as he was working on his famous essay concerning human understanding. It was written as a long letter to a friend about the education of that friend's son. There are three main themes of the book: the education of the body, the development of virtue, and the training of the mind. Locke gives very practical advice in this treatise. He insists on lots of fresh air for the children, a simple diet. Apples and pears are to be preferred over melons and plums. Very plain clothing for the boys and girls. He very much discourages overprotection, didn't like helicopter parents. Also adequate but not excessive sleep, plenty of physical exercise, and great simplicity, even for the wealthy. He also, in an interesting moment, he insists that children should be encouraged to make their own toys. And I'm told by my 10-year-old that they're just more fun when you make them yourself as well. The overarching theme is a discouragement of self-indulgence. Children should have the ability to overcome pain, lethargy, sorrow, and to become strong and independent, the kind of necessary future citizens of a free, just, and prosperous society, the one that he describes in the second treatise. The inculcation of self-control is primarily by means of praise and shame, which is to say a kind of halfway point between corporal punishment on the one hand and trying to reason with children on the other hand, neither of which you would recommend. Praise and shame are a kind of a halfway middle ground that children do respond to. Of course, religion is essential, but we should avoid getting children caught up in theological disputation. Simple biblical Christianity is sufficient. This is not the civil religion, of course, of Rousseau, but it's certainly not the Church Fathers or the Summa Theologiae either. The goal, again, is to produce virtuous, rational, industrious, and contributing citizens of the Lockean regime that is later described in the second treatise. So is there a system of morality that Locke recommends when he discusses the education of these young, budding Englishmen? And the answer seems to be yes. From section 185, the knowledge of virtue all along from the beginning. In all the instances he is capable of being taught him, more by practice than rules and the love of reputation, instead of satisfying his appetite, being made habitual in him, I know not whether he should read any other discourses of morality, but what he finds in the Bible, or have any system of ethics put into his hand until he can read Tully's Offices, not as a schoolboy to learn Latin, but as one that would be informed in the principles of virtue and the conduct and the proper conduct of life. So, yes, Cicero is important for the budding Englishman and for the creation of future citizens that will later inhabit the Lockean regime. But what is Cicero's de officiis, the offices of Cicero? If we just take a very cursory glance at it, again, 3 parts. Cicero discusses right or moral goodness, second, expediency, and then the possible conflict between moral goodness and expediency. I'm not going to pretend to say that the teaching of de officiis is easy to pin down, although Cicero does not embrace Stoicism. Overwhelmingly, any divergence between moral goodness and expediency, he says, has been much overstated. In the vast majority of cases, doing what is virtuous does mean serving one's self-interest, rightly understood, since moral goodness is much more connected to one's true happiness than material or physical goods. And so the interesting teaching there, as I read it, is that one only finds a conflict between morality and expediency when one mistakenly identifies the human good with pleasure rather than with the higher things. I have some quotes here, but I'll skip over them. So the whole system of Ciceronian morality seems to depend upon a kind of a proper understanding of a sort of philosophical anthropology. What does human happiness truly consist in? However, if you look at Locke seems to indicate that human happiness consists in precisely those things that Cicero says we must not say they consist in, namely pleasure and a virtual identification of pleasure with happiness. As Locke puts it later in the essay concerning human understanding, things then are good and evil only in reference to pleasure and pain. That which we call good is apt to cause or increase pleasure or to diminish pain in us. And on the contrary, we name that evil, which is apt to produce or increase any pain or diminish any pleasure in us, from the essay concerning human understanding. In other words, there is no objective good or evil. Good and evil are just words that we assign to things that we like or don't like. He says something similar about happiness. Happiness, then, is its full extent the utmost pleasure we are capable of, and misery the utmost pain. And the lowest degree of what can be called happiness is so much ease from all pain and so much present pleasure as without which anyone cannot be content. So Locke, paradoxically, recommends as necessary to the creation of future Lockean citizens a morality which is in many ways the inverse of his own. And I think that that's noteworthy, and I think it points to sort of a deeper problem in the Lockean project itself. Why would Locke do this? Was he just confused? Did he not realize that his own recommendation just undermined his own thought? Or was it that he recommends Cicero because he knows that there's, in a way, something flawed about his own political philosophy and the philosophical anthropology that it stands upon? Even if Lockean morality is the true morality, even if the hedonism that Locke argues for, a doctrine that Cicero, by the way, says we must fight against with horse and foot, even if that is the true morality, Ciceronian morality perhaps produces the kinds of citizens that are necessary for the Lockean state to flourish and be defended. Locke seems to be relying on classical morality to supply what is lacking in his own morality. Cicero is wrong, but he is expedient. Obviously, this comes with many dangers. One danger is that Lockean youth will actually become Ciceronians And to the point of not rushing to the defense of the Lockean regime, but rather despising the Lockean regime, whose aims are only political freedom, physical safety, and material wealth. Like the guardians of Plato's Republic, Locke runs the risk of his regime's defenders coming to despise precisely what it is they're defending. So they must read Cicero and become inspired by him to the point of living the virtues that Cicero recommends, but maybe not to become full-fledged Ciceronians who value virtue far above what Lockean society is for. So their Ciceronian, like perhaps their Christianity, should be inculcated but tempered, because in the end, Cicero and the Bible perhaps urge us to pursue virtue, natural or supernatural, for its own sake, whereas Locke wants these virtues for their expediency. So I'll end with a question. Can Locke have it both ways? And I look forward to discussing that question in the end. Question period.
Thank you, Professor Koritanski. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Deborah O'Malley, who will speak on American virtue according to Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. In Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville observed that democratic peoples are so enamored with equality that will tolerate a multitude of evils before we will ever tolerate aristocracy. He says, quote, "I think that democratic communities have a natural taste for freedom, but for equality, their passion is ardent, insatiable, incessant, invincible. They call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality and slavery. They will endure poverty, servitude, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy." Tocqueville would thus likely be unsurprised by calls in recent years to condemn the great leaders, the natural aristocrats of our past, to scour their public and private records in order to discover any possible flaw or failing. Even one such failing is enough to render them undeserving of our praise according to current standards. The most obvious examples of this trend are the toppling of statues throughout and after the summer of 2020. You actually had a lot of acts of passion there, but we also have examples of more rationalistic approaches to the leveling of great statesmen. For example, the San Francisco School District formed a renaming committee in 2017. They used a sort of meticulous checklist of grievances and voted to rename 44 schools named after anyone who met any of the criteria on that list, including Abraham Lincoln High School. But democracy's tendency towards the abandonment of greatness doesn't always result from the condemnation of greatness. It can occur in a much subtler way, through forgetting. Tocqueville noted that democracy breaks the bonds that once united generations and preserved the stories of our ancestors' noble deeds. Hence, democracy exacerbates what Lincoln called the, quote, silent artillery of time, the natural tendency to forget the great deeds of the past whose effects are no longer closely felt. Lincoln himself proposed the solution to this forgetting in his Lyceum address. Here, the 28-year-old Lincoln observed the rise of mob rule in America and contended that reverence for the laws should be the, quote, political religion of the nation. It should be breathed by every American mother, taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges, written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs, preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. The founding generation built the, quote, political edifice of liberty and equal rights through their sacrifice and spilled blood. Preserving that edifice, Lincoln exhorts, is our task of gratitude to them. Gratitude, then, is a foundational political virtue essential for the preservation of democratic societies. But how is this virtue of gratitude cultivated within the citizenry, especially when the problem isn't simply a lack of memory, but a selective memory, a memory only of the nation's defects, formed by a desire to tear down the legacy of those deemed great, and to suggest, not only are they no better than us, but they might even be worse than we are, these people that we're celebrating. So here we can turn to Lincoln's friend and fellow statesman, Frederick Douglass. In his oratory in memory of Abraham Lincoln, Douglass demonstrated how to evaluate a controversial statesman. He began by offering gratitude to Lincoln, who he described as our first martyr president, responsible for the new dispensation of freedom that Black Americans experienced because of his efforts. Not far into his speech, Douglass made a peculiar move, peculiar for a eulogy anyway, by offering some criticisms of Lincoln. Douglass explained that criticism is appropriate even at that moment because, quote, truth is proper and beautiful in all times and in all places. And he named kind of a list of objections that he had to some of Lincoln's decisions, including his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause and his refusal to interfere with slavery in the states, and his belief that the Constitution didn't allow him to do that. So he lists a few problems that he had with Lincoln's decisions and views. After offering these criticisms, he then proceeded to list Lincoln's many great contributions to the cause of freedom and equality. And then speaking separately to the Black and white members of this audience, he stated that members of his own race were not the special objects of Lincoln's consideration. So he offers criticisms, and then he offers praise, and then he's kind of going back to criticisms. Then speaking to the white audience members, he said, quote, you are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstance and necessity. He went on to say that it is especially the duty of the white race to build and multiply statues honoring Abraham Lincoln. So even after making this statement that I think would, suggest that he's sort of grieving in a sense, right? We are at best his stepchildren. He still said, raise his statues high. Hence, despite feeling grieved over some of Lincoln's actions, words, and prejudices, Douglass deemed Lincoln more than worthy of honor. He said, instead of supplanting you at his altar, again, he's speaking to the white members of the audience, instead of supplanting you at his altar, we would exhort you to build high his monuments of the most, and they should be made, he says, of the most costly material, of the most stunning workmanship. And he names a few other sort of qualifications he would have for these monuments to Lincoln. So he admonished the white members of the audience to build the statues, but here he played a critical role in guiding that construction. So notice, just kind of as a side, religious language in both Douglass and Lincoln. Lincoln in the Lyceum Address described the need for a political religion, and Douglass here references, quote, the altar to Lincoln himself. So there's a kind of fervor in this gratitude that they're both pointing to, a kind of religious element. Critically, Douglass demonstrated at the end of his eulogy to Lincoln that some of Lincoln's perceived vices were actually his virtues. He stressed the need to, quote, take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln and to make reasonable allowance for the circumstances of his position. In order to accomplish the ends of both ending the war and ending slavery, he says, Lincoln needed to work within the circumstances and even the prejudices of his time. Douglas explained, President Lincoln was a white man and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen towards the colored race. But we are compelled to admit that this unfriendly feeling on his part may be safely set down as one element of his wonderful success in organizing the loyal American people for the tremendous conflict before them. Douglas explained that Lincoln needed the sympathy and cooperation of his fellow citizens in order to accomplish his aims. In fact, such cooperation was a, quote, primary and essential condition of his success. Douglas here illustrates the prudence that statesmen must exercise in democratic societies, especially in democratic societies, a prudence that often requires moderating one's aims and the means employed to reach them. Hence, Douglas revealed that many of Lincoln's perceived weaknesses were actually his strengths. So we're here talking about civic education, of course, and I think Douglas's writings on Lincoln, as well as his writings on the founders, contain two invaluable lessons for our students. The first is that grievance and gratitude are not mutually exclusive. Modern Americans, I think contemporary Americans, treat evaluation of past and current leaders as a zero-sum game in which one strike against a statesman disqualifies him from honor. But if we look at the writings of Douglas, we can learn that honoring another human being does not entail denying his flaws or failures. We can offer criticism for the errors, mistakes, and even vices of statesmen, while also offering our gratitude for their accomplishments and sacrifices. The second lesson is that statesmen must, in a sense, be assessed differently maybe from your average citizen, especially given that statesmen in democracies must gain the support of the people. Their work must be a complex and careful combination of principle and prudence. Both Lincoln and Douglas demonstrate that the cultivation of gratitude entails forming in our students and our citizens an understanding of the true nature of political life, that it entails sacrifice, compromise, and moderation. As we heard during the lunch discussion, politics is the art of the possible. And I think both Lincoln and Douglas demonstrate this in their evaluation of statesmen and also acting as statesmen through their rhetoric in those speeches. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor O'Malley. And I'd like to invite our final panelist, Professor Jonathan Culp, who has the intriguing title, Civic Education When Everyone is Revolting.
Thank you. Yeah, originally I just wanted to call it Everyone is Revolting, but I realized that would make me sound too grumpy or too much like George Costanza, so I softened it to Civic Education When Everyone is Revolting. So at the lunchtime talk, the question was posed, what keeps you up at night? And in a way, my comments here could be taken as a status report on my thinking about one of the questions that keeps me up at night, which is, what is the use of civic education? And since I am the director of an institute devoted to civic education, could say that the subtitle of this talk could be Pessimism of the Intellect, Optimism of the Will. So since this conference, the presiding spirit of it is Winston Churchill's mass effects in modern society, that's what got me to my topic. You know, Churchill expresses this concern with mediocrity becoming a social force unto itself and shaping, grinding down that which is noble and individual. And he connects this with this concern that really there's a kind of process of technological development that has led to the empowering of mass effects, because in a large, complex society, things tend to be governed by large, complex organizations. So there's a lot less room for the individual and the less standard. And that essay made me think of a contemporaneous work by Jose Ortega y Gasset called The Revolt of the Masses. Maybe some of you have heard of that one, which is also about this idea that with the rise of mass society, the governing public opinion will be one of basically self-satisfied mediocrity, unwilling to pay attention or defer to legitimate expertise or authority. But then about 60 years later, Christopher Lasch turned this one around and wrote a book called The Revolt of the Elites, saying the elites are actually the problem because in a certain sense they have seceded from ordinary life through their meritocratic cursus honorum, their global mobility, their positions of professional management. They have basically separated themselves from ordinary life, ordinary solidarity, and they're really the problem. And then about 10 years ago, Martin Gurry wrote a book called The Revolt of the Public, about how the rise, especially of social media, has led to a crisis of authority in society because the rapid, easy availability of information means that it's much easier to expose hypocrisy in high places. So it's a lot harder for leaders to keep themselves in credit because they're under such scrutiny. But at the same time, that critical impulse that the public has is a merely destructive one, that you can't build just with criticism. So you end up with a situation that he describes as sort of hypocritical elites and irresponsible masses. So hence the title, Everyone is Revolting. I mean, if the masses are revolting and the elite are revolting, then there's nobody left except, of course, everybody in this room accepted. So I just want to say a few things about how I think of civic education in this context of universal revolt. But I think to clarify it a little bit, I'd mention what I understand mass democracy to be, since our panel is called Civic Education and Mass Democracy, because we're talking about something different from what Tocqueville was dealing with. In Tocqueville's time, the locus of most political activity was local. And it came through face-to-face participation. You could say, in a way, that ordinary citizens didn't really need a whole lot of civics classes because they learned civics through the practical experience of living in their own community. But that's not us anymore. We're in a situation of a mass democracy where, for the most part, political decisions are made somewhere else by someone else. As Tocqueville memorably puts it, a large foreigner called the government, right, makes most of the decisions. And so they're out of our hands, which means that voters and ordinary citizens are oftentimes left in the situation of being what Brian Kaplan and Jason Brennan, among others, have provocatively called a state of rational ignorance, meaning that ordinary citizens oftentimes are quite ignorant of politics and political principles, but when you think about it, you can realize that it is rational for them to be ignorant because it's not exactly clear what increased political knowledge would actually do for them, what good it would do them, and what good they could do with civic knowledge when they have no real access to any real decisions. Right? For the most part, politics is a spectator sport for ordinary citizens. They have at most symbolic participation or retweets. So you have this interesting situation, of course, exacerbated by what Gurry called the revolt of the public, where the glare of social media does mean that even though for the most part you can't have actual impact, you can have these sort of mass impacts through social media exposure of what's going on. So we're in a very kind of puzzling and novel, I would say, situation when it comes to civics. So for the average citizen, what is the good of civic education if politics is so far away and often inaccessible to them? And how can a college course do much to address what are in some ways structural problems? Now, the solutions, I would say, to these problems are elusive and imperfect, but not completely absent. There's obviously no single solution to the problem, much less one that could be delivered in a classroom. And it's important to remember, as Tim Carney has movingly written about in Alienated America, that it's not just politics. We live in a society where generally communal life has been hollowed out in many ways. And so to think that somehow you can do something in a classroom that's going to be able to repair the damage or restore the health of a society that is not just civically ailing. That would be hubristic. But nonetheless, to begin with, I would say that the classroom remains probably the last place where we can actually count on citizens receiving deliberate instruction about the principles of constitutionalism, self-government. I mean, if not in the classroom, where anymore? So civic education is necessary, if not sufficient. But then you have to think about what's the most effective way to deliver civic education. And here I want to make just a couple proposals, and these are provisional proposals. I'd like to hear more, because I think that when it comes to civic education at the collegiate level, and below that actually, curricular decisions should be made specifically with a view to future leaders and statesmen, and only secondarily to average citizens. And I actually think that that will benefit both of those groups. And here I'm not just talking about future statesmen, not just political leaders, but anybody who will be a leader in some way in their community, because we do still have those. And it might sound obvious to say it, but it should be said that it is those future statesmen or leaders who are the ones that are most likely to actually put into practice what they learn in the classroom, since they're going to be navigating situations where they need to know how the system works, if only in order to change it. They're going to be navigating the upper reaches of our institutions. And I want to make another proposal about this. It should be aimed at leaders, and also by giving great attention to providing concrete and inspiring portraits or biographies or autobiographies of statesmen and leaders. And obviously here at an ISI conference, I don't need to talk about the importance of providing, great lives and examples of great leaders. But I do want to say one of the reasons why I think it's important is because by having inspiring and lively examples as a key part of civic education, that's going to give greater force to the more abstract information or ideas that they get in civic education, right? Like if you think you're somebody who might be making laws, you now have much more of a reason to care about how a bill becomes a law. Right, things like that. As we know, what is it that Hobbes says? The desires are the scouts and spies of the intellect. So by providing inspiration, you give meaning to the otherwise dry civics curriculum. Now, obviously, the principles, the ideas, those all have to be there too. But the exemplary character of the education, I think, will provide a better motive to think through those ideas. And so I think this would be beneficial. Obviously, it'll be beneficial for future leaders, both because it could serve to guide the ambition of those who are already ambitious, but also it can serve to inflame the ambition of those who have great potential, but perhaps have not been given the opportunity to realize that. Gives them something to aim for. But I also think it's beneficial to ordinary citizens because it will give them more concrete standards to judge things by, to see what responsible and great leaders look like. Now, obviously, again, in the era of the revolt of the public, there's potential for that to backfire a little bit, like when nobody is a hero to their Twitter followers, right? Or to their valets. But nonetheless, by having some common models of excellence, or using civic education to have common models of excellence, there's at least some more room for convergence of standards between leaders and the rest of us. So this model of civic education, I think broadly adopted, could help address the revolt of the public by giving us worthier leaders and more responsible publics. Though again, it has to be part of a broader project of renewal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you.
What's that?
Move this out of the way.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Now you can look each of us in the eye if you choose. I want to begin, ask a couple of questions before we open it up to the floor to have a general discussion. So Dr. Thomas, part of Cicero's defense of the Roman regime as a civic education, and perhaps this is merely rhetorical, but is to defend it, and the voice of Scipio at least, as the best regime, sort of a historical instantiation of the best regime. It seems possible that, or and maybe this is a question, does Cicero think that that's necessary for a civic education, for the citizens to see their regime as the best one? But for us who may want to draw upon Cicero as in our own regime, and there's people here who are a part of something called the Ciceronian Society, right? So there's apparently quite a lot of you out there who want to do this. Do we have to do something like that? Do we have to make a defense of America as the best regime? And I have a sort of follow-up that'll go to both you and Professor Koritanski in just a second after that.
I think for everything to kind of come together for Cicero, he has to see Rome as, in terms of his own conditions, the best one could expect, and to be grateful for the chance he had to be part of that. Because of the way in which it's not just kind of for particular reasons that he is very interested in political life and in serving the Republic, which is that it sort of it brings one into contact with men of good character and of some kind of culture. So if Rome were not a conventional aristocracy of a certain kind, with certain kind of forms of education, a tradition of oratory, and these kinds of things, it's hard to see how he would counsel people to live the way that he did, as opposed to living in some other way. So it seems like, as he puts it, or Scipio puts it in the Republic, he wants to bring together the two paths of prudence, the prudence of our fathers, who were devoted to our Roman institutions, and the prudence of Plato or Socrates. And he thinks you can do that, and it seems hard. Surely there are things in the Roman Constitution, particularly in his time, that he thinks are not perfect, but it is kind of, in its best moments, a tolerable, even exemplary practical achievement within which to work and which to protect. So I think, in terms of thinking about that today, it does seem like taking your own regime and circumstances in some way normative will be an essential part of civic education. How can you make the most of your situation if you are, unless you take it as something good, have kind of a kind of gratitude for it. I thought Debbie kind of gave an example of how one could do that. And if you look at Book 2 of the Republic, the way Cicero teaches appreciation for the Roman political tradition, it's not simply as everything is good. He's very clear about the defective origins of it, of the various things that have gone wrong, of the way in which there's kind of natural tendency toward decline. It's quite clear there. But he wants to, I think he wants to push very hard to get you, the reader, to see in what you think to be very defective circumstances, in fact, a great opportunity to demonstrate your virtue by seeing what is best in, and seeing the best reflected somehow in your circumstances and trying to preserve it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So my follow-up, which gets to both of your papers, not just because they both happen to be about Cicero or reception of Cicero, is what if, so many of these centers, and we've all talked about how in our various programs, we want to draw upon both liberal education and civic education. Mm-hmm. Now, what if the student engaged in liberal education has an experience like what Locke actually is afraid might happen if you read Cicero, which is to say, what if you start to think that maybe this regime is not the best regime, and the good citizen in the democratic republic is not the good man, simply speaking. So isn't, I guess, this is actually a question, even though it sounds like a rhetorical question, isn't a little bit of liberal learning a dangerous thing in the civics? I don't want to call it the civics business, but maybe in America that there might be something to that. What if, how many of us have had the experience of having students, for example, who have read exactly 10% of Tocqueville's Democracy in America and then decided they understand the soul of America and how corrupt it is, right? Yeah. So I guess could you speak to that? How do we engage in, can we engage in liberal education and civic education, or as you put it, Dr. Thomas, trying to draw on was it the prudence of Socrates and also the prudence of Scipio? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm happy either of you could.
The way Cicero formulates this problem, I think, directly is in his discussion of Cato and his suicide in On Duties, Book 1, where he gives a kind of defense of that as a necessary kind of last step in a life that was so devoted to virtue and a kind of constancy of character and a kind of devotion to the Republic that he couldn't accept the new order of things. He could not take a kind of pardon from Caesar and just go about living his life. He had to die with the Republic. And Cicero compares him to Ajax in this respect. He's the kind of man who cannot bear an insult. His greatness isn't a kind of fortitude and a kind of attachment that goes along with a keen sense of honor and insult that can't be borne. And he says that another kind of person, he doesn't say who it is, but I think he clearly means himself, is more like Odysseus, able to endure any kind of insult to get what he wants. And it just seems like that is sort of a kind of related to the problem you're describing, is that for Cicero, that Cato is a kind of problem of someone who is demanding their regime be best, and they realize that there are things that are wrong, and then there's a kind of alienation. And what does one do? Cicero trains himself, and you read his letters, he gets very alienated from Rome, but he also has a kind of private life. He has something else going, that he's not personally undone by the republics coming apart at various points. And that seems to be kind of the ideal for him, is somehow to train yourself to be useful to your country when it happens that you might be able to be useful to it, as he was in the Catilinarian conspiracy, but also able to endure when there isn't a chance for that, when politics is bad. And that's where, for him, that's where philosophy is kind of therapeutic for him in this respect. He describes reading Plato and rewriting Plato's works as a kind of way of dealing with the fact that there's no politics. So I think for the person you're describing, civic education, liberal education would have to kind of, from Cicero's perspective, allow one to metabolize the disappointment that you read Plutarch, right? You read these things, and then you look around you. And the way that I think Cicero metabolized that was by continuously reading Plato throughout his life and having kind of a realization that politics in the end is not consistently going to be what you ask of it. Peter.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. There is a danger there of bolstering a emphatically modern regime with a pre-modern, I would even say emphatically pre-modern morality. And I guess I would just say this, that if it's possible to, if it's possible for the young Englishman to imbibe and internalize a kind of watered down, non-sectarian, de-theologized Christianity, then maybe it's also possible for them to imbibe a kind of watered down Ciceronianism. It seems to me one of the problems that this is trying to solve is the fact that Lockean politics is fundamentally a reconception of politics, but which Locke inherited from Hobbes, under which politics is conceived as a social contract, a cooperative venture, whereby the only thing that justifies your participation in it is that you get more out of it than you put in. And that might work well for a while, but when that regime calls upon you to sacrifice and to make deep sacrifices, that conception of society and your own regime as a cooperative venture falls well short. And there must be those in society who have an element of Ciceronianism, who as I read, I mean, I think Adam's probably a more thorough student of Cicero than I am, but it does seem as though, especially in book one of De Officiis, that he really does adopt that Aristotelian view of the political community as a prompting of nature itself, not a human construction, and something that perfects our nature as human beings. And I think that there has to be an element of that in the Lockean regime, but there is the danger that it will backfire, and that is something that should be on the minds of those who are. I think most of us on this stage are constantly grappling, or will be constantly grappling with just how do we understand the relationship between civic education and liberal education. The two are not they are not the same, and they don't have the same goal necessarily. But I think we all believe and have a really a firm conviction that if civic education is to be something more than just something very shallow, it must be undergirded with a liberal education. Those nuances and those tensions notwithstanding. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, it is a difficult question of how to lead students through a liberal education with certain civic aims without generating cynics or skeptics. It is indeed quite a tall order. So for that tall order, I'd like to turn to you, Professor, because you have all the answers to all of this, just while you're here. So
Off the hook.
I want to ask, you said that grievance and gratitude don't necessarily have to be, or can go together, and I took you to mean that we can look at, say, the founders, warts and all, and see their virtues, their vices, take into account, as you said, judge the statesman according to a different standard based on the constraints upon them, the prudential constraints. So you can certainly take this question in whichever direction you would like, but I wonder how do we, I'm thinking in terms of the classroom, how do we go about teaching the founders, especially when many of our students have already imbibed. It may not be the 1619 project. It could be something else entirely. It could be, I guess Howard Zinn is still read, or at least influential. So, it could come in with certain governing opinions they've already imbibed for quite a long time. And we have to be the ones to tell them that we should still listen to Thomas Jefferson, despite the fact of Sally Hemings and slavery and such. So what sort of practical advice, because I see this as being where we can exercise our own prudential wisdom. So what would you suggest?
So this is going to sound like such a cheat answer, but I'm going to just start with reading Frederick Douglass. And part of what motivated me to write this presentation, I'm not somebody who has written on Frederick Douglass, hopefully in the future, but I'm not a Douglass scholar. But some of these observations just came through teaching Douglass and observing the reactions that students had. So I found that students come into the classroom with, a skepticism of the founding. They, I think I mentioned some of the Tocqueville's observations about egalitarianism and wanting to and how I think that is a partial explanation for the desire to tear down. But I also think there's just kind of an understandable discomfort with praising somebody who owned other human beings, right? So I think there are different reasons for why the students sort of come in with this skepticism or discomfort with the founders. And but I think it's also, I think that the concerns about the actions of these particular statesmen cause them to dislike their country as well, right? So the statesmen are kind of defining America for them, and I think it's actually unnatural not to love your own country. So Aristotle talks about how there is a kind of natural self-love. There's excessive self-love, which is problematic, but we naturally do love ourselves and what is our own. And so I think the students have really been educated away from that natural instinct to love what is their own. And I think Douglas gives them permission to do that. And I've seen that in the students' reaction. So I always teach, I've taught something from Douglas in almost all, or all of my classes actually, because I'm thinking Model Senate, we even did read a little bit of Douglas, because he has something to say about everything. And I found that students, especially in the debate between Douglas and William Lloyd Garrison over whether the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery, they seem to be relieved that they can think of our Constitution and our nation as something good. And so I think that does kind of start with having Douglas kind of walk through this assessment of the founders. So for example, in his 4th of July speech, where he actually said, I'm not going to join you in this celebration. He delivered it on the 5th. He said, I can't join you in this celebration. That the fruits of this revolution, we are not fully experiencing. But yet he begins that speech with gratitude for the founders and says they sacrificed for their country. And while that's not the highest thing that a person can do, it is worthy of praise. So reading Douglas is part of my answer, I guess, just because I've seen the reactions of students being genuinely persuaded by him. And, I present Douglas and Garrison, make the best case for both and try to conceal who I'm more persuaded by. So, yeah, so I think that's part of it. Another part, just this is very practical, but this is something that I've done in my classes, and I'm happy to share materials with folks, is actual exercises where the students play the part of a particular statesman. So some folks might be familiar with the reacting to the past, recreation of the Constitutional Convention. I think that, if you're a Southern delegate and you want to win, it really puts them in the mind of particular statesmen. So I teach a Model Senate class that helps students to get into sort of the minds of statesmen as well. But I think assigning Frederick Douglass along with a lot of these other thinkers that we've discussed, Aristotle on prudence so that they understand what that is, Cicero, it's really, I think, it's necessary, not sufficient for solving all the problems in our country, but I think it's helpful to restore that kind of natural love of one's own country.
Yeah.